Welcome to the Economic and Political History Podcast, where we discuss the latest ideas on the intersection of economics, political science, and history. Everyone, welcome to a new episode of the Economic and Political History Podcast. I'm your host, Javier Mejia from Stanford University. And today I have the great pleasure of being with Eric Klein. Eric is professor of classics, history, and anthropology at the George Washington University, where he's also the director of the GWU Capital Archaeological Institute. Eric is the author of, I want to make sure that I show the cover properly. This is my copy, which is an not fully ready one, but the book is coming soon, and it's called After 1177 BC, The Survival of Civilizations. It's a book published by Princeton University Press, which is the sequel of 1177 BC, The Year Civilization Collapse, which is a book that I love, and we're going to talk a bit about the prequel, but we're going to get to that in a bit. Let me say hi to Eric first. Eric, how are you? Thanks a lot for being here.
Oh, hi, and great. Thank you for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here and to talk about the books.
It's great. I'm super excited about this conversation. We were just talking offline about how I'm an economist, but I hang out a lot with archaeologists here at Stanford. And part of it began when I read your first book. Well, your first book, not the prequel of this series, right? I was totally fascinated by it, and so I always thought that it would be great that you would write another book, so I could have the opportunity to invite you and chat with you about this.
That,
And we're gonna talk a lot about the book and the two of them. But let me ask you first about your career. I wanna know about how you ended up becoming an archaeologist, interested in in the Bronze Age. I know you haven't worked just only on that period, but that's recently, I guess, your specialty and the region that you're interested in, right? So the Eastern Mediterranean in particular. What's your story?
so it goes back to when I was 7 years old, and my parents gave me a book on ancient Troy. It was about Heinrich Schliemann, the man who dug up Troy, and I read the book, age of 7, and announced I was going to be an archaeologist, and that was that. So it's a cautionary tale. Be careful what you give your kids to read because it may shape the rest of their lives. And in fact, when I graduated from college, my parents gave me the book again as a graduation present because I had majored in archaeology, and I still have the book today. It's in
Oh,
my office. It's called The Walls of Windy Troy. So not only have I always been interested in archaeology and ancient history, but I've been interested particularly in the Bronze Age, which is what that book was all about, because ancient Troy, Trojan War, that actually happens, I think, as part and parcel of the collapse of the late Bronze Age, about 1200 BCE. So it goes way back to my childhood. And interestingly, Heinrich Schliemann, the guy that the book was about, also claims that his parents gave him a book when he was 7 or 8 that led him to go search for ancient Troy and to see if the Trojan War had actually happened. So Schliemann is the man that archaeologists love to hate. So I don't really want to make a comparison, but I do find it interesting that we both read books at about the same age that then dictated what we were going to do for our careers.
that's interesting. And then because you have thought about this, you have at least one book about the history of archaeology, right? And I'm also curious about how you have seen the field evolving over, well, your career, but also how you see it moving forward into the future. What do you think are those big changes happening? Is it just a methodological element? Is it also evolving um focused like conceptually, thematic wise?
Yeah, so these are big questions that you asked, and we could spend the entire time just on one of them. But yeah, to go back to the initial question, in terms of the story of archaeology, I at JW I teach the introductory course, the Introduction to Archaeology. I've got 140 students in it each fall, and then another professor teaches another 70 in the spring. So there's a lot of interest in archaeology. I mean, that's more than 200 people just right there per year. And we've actually graduated almost 200 archaeology majors in the last 20 years, which is a lot. None of them have jobs, but so it goes. But so there's a lot of interest. And one of the things that I did at one point for Princeton um, was to take my class lectures that I gave for that intro class and wrap them together into a book called Three Stones Make a Wall, exactly, which is a saying in archaeology. One stone is a stone. Two stones is a feature, meaning that it's something that's human made, but you might not know what it is. Three stones are a wall. And then it goes from there. Four stones is a building, five stones is a palace, six stones is a palace built by aliens. It goes on like that. Three stones make a wall is a phrase common that all archaeologists know about. So I thought that would be good for the title of the book. And in the book itself, I talk about some of the great discoveries in archaeology, Troy, Pompeii, Machu Picchu, things like that. But I also interspersed it with the questions that I'm asked most frequently. How do you know where to dig? That is, how do you find a site? How do you know how to dig? That one's easy. I'm like, well, if you're, gardening in your backyard, it's kind of the same thing, only this stuff is, 4,000 years old. So, and in fact, one of the other chapters is how do you know how old this is? And so on. And we, in fact, did a spinoff of that book a year or two later where we just took those digging deeper chapters, how do you know where to dig? And made that a little tiny book that would fit in your back pocket, with the idea being that anybody going on an excavation could bring it along with them and kind of use it as a handbook. So that little guy, it's like less than $10, and it's called Digging Deeper. So I figure those are kind of my contributions to pushing the field forward, but also looking at where we have come from. And as part of that, towards the end of both Three Stones and Digging Deeper, I address some of the other questions that you just asked, namely, what are the advances that we've seen? And where do I think we're going? So some of the major advances that we've got over the last century or two are technological, of course. We now have things like remote sensing. We can use magnetometers to peer beneath the earth without ever excavating, which sometimes works, doesn't always work. Now we're in basically what some are calling the third wave of archaeology, where we're using the life sciences, the exact sciences, ancient DNA, for example, and we're using that now to get to peer into places that we couldn't have gotten before. So I think in part we're going to keep going that way. We're going to be using more and more and more science. Along the way, though, came theory, and there's a lot of archaeological theory that gets attached to absolutely everything. So we've got basically something for everything. I mean, I'm a dirt archaeologist. I like going out, getting dirty, getting sweaty, and actually finding the stuff. The theory I mostly leave to others, though I will link to it if it's necessary to, support my arguments or what have you. So there's room for pretty much everybody in this field. One of the things that I do ask, kind of tongue in cheek, at the end of the books is, what will future generations think of us if our societies collapse or, if something happens? For instance, I think they are going to totally misidentify Starbucks. And I think they're going to totally misidentify McDonald's. I strongly suspect that they're going to think that those are both religions.
Rich. Yeah.
And in case, I think, in the case of Starbucks, it really is a religion. But, imagine what they're going to find. They're on every block. There is the green goddess with the flowing locks on the Starbucks cup. There's Ronald McDonald with his orange hair. I mean, that looks like Zeus and Hera. It looks like Jupiter and Juno. It's, like the Greek and Roman gods. So I think they're going to misinterpret us. And imagine what they're going to do with finding something like a museum, right? Like the Smithsonian. That's going to just knock them for a loop. And anyway, there's a very funny book that was written a while ago called The Motel of the Mysteries, in which somebody finds a Motel 6 in a couple hundred years and completely misidentifies it. And I actually have my students read that for the last week of class, showing, this is some of the dangers in archaeology of misidentification. So anyway, it's a lot of fun. Archaeology is a lot of fun to do, always fascinating, always something new coming up. And it keeps you on the edge of your seat, no matter what you do and when you work and where you work. So, I happen to have chosen the Aegean and the Eastern Mediterranean to work because that's the place I'm interested in, as well as the Bronze Age. But, working over in the New World is fascinating too. I think if I had to redo my career, I might study the Maya, for example, or the Etruscans. I mean, there's so much that we still don't know about where we came from, antiquity.
Let me use that to start thinking about what you discuss in the book, and I would like first to talk about the collapse, which is what you talk about in the prequel of this new book. And well, first I would like you to describe what was this episode that you frame as a collapse, and then I would like to ask you about the way in which you have perceived the success of, well, I guess the book, right? In my opinion, it has been an extraordinarily successful academic book. What do you think that has been the origin of that interest? Is this connected to a larger increasing interest in archaeology? Is it because we're concerned about things going south today? Is it about the region? I don't know. How have you experienced? And also, I would like to ask you, were you expecting such a good reception from the public when you first came up with the idea? Tell me about that.
Yeah, in fact, let me start with that last and then segue back to everything else because um, no, I had no idea that 1177 BC would be so successful and that so many people would be interested. Never in my wildest imaginations did I ever think that it would do so well. Um, yeah, I think the problem is that everyone's worried about us today, that they all think we're going to collapse. And for that matter, I think we are too. So, there's that. So I think it resonates. It touched a nerve. I mean, it came out in 2014, and things have really just kind of gotten worse in the world since then. And I put out a revised edition in 2021 because there was so much new information that I said we need a expanded version, and that one has continued to sell well. I mean, the book has been translated, I think, into 16 languages at the moment, and there's a 17th coming out on the same day that the sequel will be published. There's also going to be a graphic version of the original coming out, which has been drawn by Glynis Fawkes, an amazing artist, cartoonist, and archaeologist. And it took knowing the archaeology as well as being an extremely skilled cartoonist. She literally translated the book into a graphic version. It's absolutely gorgeous. And so like I say, I never expected it would sell. It sold, I think it sold more than all my other books combined. So, as I've said, it's just, lightning struck. I don't know if it'll strike again. I don't know if it'll strike with the sequel either. But we shall see. So I think the timing was just right. But I also have to say that it was not my idea at all to write it. I was approached by Rob Tempio of Princeton University Press back in about 2007. I was on sabbatical and I was working on a completely different project. And he came down from Princeton to Washington, D.C., and took me out to lunch and said, I want you to write a book on the collapse of the late Bronze Age. And I said, why? You've already published a book on it. Back in 1993, Robert Drews wrote a book for you guys, for Princeton. And he's like, yeah, but that was, 20 years ago. Things have changed. I said, yeah, they've changed a bit. And he said, well, will you write a book on the collapse? And I said, no, I'm not interested. And he's like, what do you want to write about? I said, I want to write about what collapsed. I want to write about the Mycenaeans, the Minoans, the Hittites, the Canaanites. And so he said, and I'm paraphrasing here, he said, let's make a deal. You begin and end the book with the collapse, and in the middle you can write about whatever you want. I'm like, okay, now we're talking. And so that's how the book came about, the original book. And so I start with a discussion of the Sea Peoples, they used to be blamed for this late Bronze Age collapse. And then I take a step backwards. I say, well, let's examine what collapsed. And so for the middle section of the book, I walk the readers through the 15th century BC, the 14th, the 13th, and then ending with the 12th century BC. And not only tell them the history of what was going on with the Mycenaeans, Minoans, Canaanites, Cypriots, but also I gave them a little background into the archaeology. Who discovered each one of them? Right? Who discovered the Minoans? Who discovered the Mycenaeans? And so some of the readers like that, and others don't, because it's only at the very end of the book, the last two chapters, that I say, okay, so now that we know what collapsed, let's actually look at the collapse and look at the various possibilities. And so we get people on Amazon going, he spent most of the book talking about what happened before the collapse. I'm like, yeah, well, now you know. So anyway, so I had a good deal of fun with it, and I think it does answer a lot of the questions. And that, from my point of view, I'm thrilled at the success of the book because it means that more people in the world now know about the late Bronze Age and about the collapse, which, everybody's heard of the fall of the Roman Empire, but how many people have heard of the collapse of the late Bronze Age? And yet the magnitude of the late Bronze Age collapse was just as impactful as the fall of the Roman Empire. So I feel like kind of like I'm bringing the word to the street of the late Bronze Age collapse, and I'm just thrilled that that many more people are now conversant with what happened. And looking on, gosh, places like on YouTube, where now videos and podcasts are proliferating, where other people are pontificating about the late Bronze Age collapse, usually without any acknowledgement of what I and my colleagues have done. But, that's okay. But I'm absolutely thrilled. And even the memes that are coming up, there was one a while ago that said, how often do you think about the Romans? And the answer was,
I heard
several
about that.
times a
Yeah.
day, right? And then I saw the parallel, how often do you think about the Sea Peoples? Several times. And I'm like, yes, I love it. So anyway, so that was fun. And then Rob asked me if I would write a sequel after 1177, what happened afterward. And again, I said at first that I wasn't particularly interested because there is this divide between archaeologists who do the Bronze Age and archaeologists who do the Iron Age. And there are very few people that cross over. And I was not one of them. I'm a Bronze Age person. Somebody like Ian Morris at Stanford is an Iron Age person. And yet, we cross the divide upon occasion. And so, having looked into it a bit and realized just how much was appropriate to today, because the sequel involves questions about resilience and what do you do after your society has collapsed. I realized that it resonated with today also, just like the original book had done as well. So I agreed to write it, but it is slightly different because it goes geographically. I had written it chronologically, 12th century, 11th, 10th, 9th, 8th. And then I'm like, no, I'm getting whiplash. So let's do it geographically and look at 8 case studies of what you do or don't do after the collapse. So to go back to the original book for just a second, as I mentioned, it does deal with Mycenaeans, Minoans, Hittites, and all of that. The G8, as I call them, of the ancient world. And in 1200 BC, they were happily interacting. It was a globalized Mediterranean, as some have called it. And then just within a couple of decades, everything collapsed. Everything that had been happily working economically, politically, diplomatically for up to 300 years by that point, suddenly within 20, 30 years is completely gone. The societies themselves are not all gone, but the connected network collapsed and everything fell apart. They were not self-sustainable enough. So when one went down, the others followed. It was a domino effect. And so that's the big question is what caused that? And could that happen to us today? So spoiler alert, towards the end of the book, the original book, I looked at the various causes that have been suggested, which include climate change, drought, famine, earthquakes, disease, invaders, migration. And I looked at the evidence for each of these suggestions and then decided to rank them. And instead of ranking them, I just said, yes, 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 everything happened. That's the problem. It was a perfect storm, I think. It was, as my kids say, a series of unfortunate events, to quote Lemony Snicket. You can survive a drought, you can survive a famine, you can survive an earthquake. A lot of people will die, but your society doesn't usually collapse, right? The economy usually hangs in there. Political systems usually hang in. But what if you have one, two, three, or four of these at the same time or in quick succession so that you can't rebound from one, you can't recover from one before the next one hits. And I think that's what happened. And the data that came out between 2014 and 2021, the reason why I wanted to put out the revised edition was that there were a lot more scientific studies that came out showing the impact that there was climate change back then and the impact of the drought. But also there were new written records that were finally published, first in French and then in English from, for instance, the site of Ugarit in what is now North Syria on the coast. And they said, not only is there famine, I mean, they actually said there is famine here in Ugarit, they also talk about invaders showing up. And so I thought that merited um, a new version. But of course, the bogeyman of the sea peoples is still in there. The records that the Egyptians left mentioning these people that had attacked Egypt not once, but twice in a 30-year period, 1207 and 1177. They still figure in, but I don't think they're the main reason. I think they're victim as much as they are oppressors. They're refugees, if you will, fleeing from the drought. So anyway, that was a very, very long answer to your question, but I hope I covered most of it.
No, that's fantastic because it builds the right framework to get into the weeds and talk about what's in this sequel. And you do have this structure, this geographical structure. and that's how you approach the question, which I think, by the way, that it's a great approach because I think it highlights this element that the global dimension of this world disappear, right? And what you have then left are these localish stories, right? And and why don't we start to get into those different episodes, right? So you start with Egypt and the southern Levant, right? And then like it's actually interesting because you do describe the interconnection between these two regions. And you start to see a heterogeneous landscape, right? So on the one hand, you have Egypt declining, but then you have the emergence of these new communities that are going to be quite influential for centuries, if not millennia. Um, what's the story there? Why did Egypt, that seemed to have sort of survived fairly well to the collapse, as it seemed to have been the one defeating the sea people and so on, somehow ended up declining regardless? And what's the story then up north, right, with the emergence of the well, the Israelis and the Philistinians? What's the story there?
Yeah, so good questions. And what we've got basically, and this is what I deal with in the sequel, as you mentioned, going geographically worked much better than going chronologically because, as I mentioned, we've got 8 case studies about what happened and what to do and what not to do if your society collapses. So Egypt and the southern Levant, which is chapter 1, are linked because Egypt had been in control of Canaan, right? Modern day Israel, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Palestinian territories. And by 1140 BC, Egypt has withdrawn from those regions and gone back behind its own borders. Because what happens is that Egypt doesn't do all that well in terms of resilience, not when you compare it to the other societies. In fact, at one point, what I do towards the end of the book, and I should say that though the first 5 chapters, the geographic chapters, where we've got Egypt and the southern Levant in the first chapter, and I've got Assyria and Babylonia in the second, Cyprus and Phoenicia in the third. The fourth is the Hittites and the Neo-Hittites, and then the fifth is Mycenaeans and Minoans. In the sixth chapter, that's where I do the analyses. And one of the things I do is to rank the societies as to how well they did. And the Egyptians come in right in the middle. They're not wonderful and they're not terrible. They are coping. They're not really adapting. They're not really transforming. These are other definitions that I put in. I actually pull from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, as well as the adaptive cycle, which is used in environmental studies and such, empires rise and fall, that kind of idea in history. But so in terms of the ranking, Egypt was basically coping, which is they're living for the moment. They're just trying to survive. They're not even looking that far ahead. And so they do survive, but the political system, to a certain extent, is in chaos. We're moving into what's called the third intermediate period at that time. And I should say that I'm covering 4 centuries in this book, from 1177 down to the early 8th century, basically 776 BC, which is the traditional date for the first Olympics. So that's how far down I go. But a lot of that time period in Egypt is what's known as the third intermediate period, which is usually looked at as a time of kind of chaos and anarchy internally. And at one point, we've got no fewer than 3 or 4 different men, all claiming that they're Pharaoh of Egypt and each ruling in a different part of the country. So what happens, though, is Egypt does survive, but they kind of roll back off of the international stage. All right, they're just consumed with surviving inside. There is some attempt later where they move out and reenact and reconnect with the southern Levant. They may actually take over some of the copper mines in what is now Jordan by the 10th or 9th centuries BC. But overall, Egypt is really just on its own. Over in the southern Levant, it's a whole other story too, because we have the Canaanites there. And I have to be careful here to split. I mean, Canaan goes in modern terms all the way from what is now North Syria, all the way down to the Sinai Peninsula. So in the book, I talk about northern Canaanites, central Canaanites, and southern Canaanites. And the northern Canaanites, in part, become part of the Neo-Hittite, which we'll talk about. The central Canaanites become the Phoenicians. We'll talk about them. And the southern Canaanites, though, well, here's the problem. They either morph into or are overtaken by new peoples. Namely, in the Iron Age in the southern Levant, we get now new small kingdoms. We get the kingdom of Israel, the kingdom of Judah, kingdom of Edom, Moab, Ammon, right? We get like 5 smaller kingdoms as opposed to the Canaanite city-states that had been there and the Egyptian rule that had been there during the late Bronze Age. So one of the questions that I ask in the book and where I'm ranking them is where to put the southern Canaanites. Because if they are overtaken by newcomers, like if you believe the Exodus took place at this time, which it may well have, then the Canaanites are overcome by the invading Israelites. And depending on whether you go with the book of Judges or the book of Joshua in the Hebrew Bible, it's either a genocide or it's an assimilation, depending on which way you want to look at it. But there are other people who say that the Israelites were already in the land, that the Exodus had already taken place earlier, and that the Israelites are up in the highlands. And only when the Egyptians retreat do they come down from the highlands. So, and still others say that the Canaanites and the Israelites, they're actually one and the same. So there's all kinds of historical and archaeological problems here that have not yet been resolved. So I decided to say the southern Canaanites did badly, that they were not resilient, that they either vanished or were assimilated, and these new small kingdoms take over. Others may wish to argue that they should be like up in number 2, that they were very resilient, that they adapted and became part of these new kingdoms. So that's where I expect the discussions with my colleagues to take place, which is good because my book hopefully will start the discussion, not end it. But so this is another example too, where there's something for everybody, I would say. The first 5 chapters are basically a history book with some archaeology tossed in. And then the last chapter is an analysis. So if you don't know anything about the period, well, you're going to learn a lot. And you'll be completely confused by all the names, right? Lots of new names and places. And so there's actually a list at the back of the people that are mentioned. So you can flip to the back and see who is who. But even for my colleagues and everyone that I know at Stanford who already know this stuff, they're going to be able to grapple with it and say, we agree with you on this, but we totally disagree on this. So let's talk and, let's have a mini conference. We'll all come out to Palo Alto for a day or whatever. So I'm hoping there's something for everyone. Whether or not it appeals as much as the first book, I have no idea. We shall see. Will lightning strike twice? I've been told that, first of all, the sequels never sell as well as the original. And I've also been told that people are much more interested in collapse than they are in survival and resilience. So we'll see. We'll see. But I mean, hasn't that TV show Survivor been on the air for like 1 million years now? So So we'll see. But anyway, so that's the answer to your question about Egypt and the Southern Levant, which I deal with just in the first chapter.
Let me use that tone of thinking about how important it can be, not only survival, but reflourishment, if you want, and jump to the third chapter where you remain partly on central Canaan and you talk about the Phoenicians, which are probably the most successful community of this context, right? And there, I guess I would like to ask you about how important it was for the flourishment of this community. And you could argue that even the small kingdoms at the southern part of Canaan uh, are somewhat example of this. How important was the retreat of the Egyptian influence for the consolidation of these new polities and the well economic flourishment of these communities? What's the story there then with the Phoenicians? Where do they come from? What's the source of their prosperity that is going to last for centuries ahead, even in, well, classic antiquity, of course? And what's the role of the Egyptians just not being there?
Right. So again, small questions, small questions. Yeah, right. Well, so and yes, the Phoenicians, all right, so the Phoenicians, who are the central Canaanites, they survived. It's the small city states in what is today modern Lebanon, right? And by the way, the Phoenicians never called themselves Phoenicians. That's what the later Greeks, like Herodotus, called them. They referred to themselves by their city states. I am from Tyre. I am from Byblos. I am from Sidon. I'm from Beirut, right? So they saw themselves as individual members of individual city states. But as a whole, we refer to them as Phoenicians, and they do continue on because they will found Carthage, for example, in North Africa, and eventually go up against the Romans. You've got the Punic Wars, Romans against Carthaginians. So the Phoenicians continue on for a very long time. Now, what they have done, and since they do manage to survive, they bridge the transition between Bronze Age and Iron Age in central Canaan with very little problem. As far as we can tell, there are almost no destructions there. Part of the problem, though, is there hasn't been that much archaeology done in the region because a lot of the modern cities are right on top of the ancient cities. So it's hard to hard to dig. But still, we've got a fair amount of evidence there. So they do survive, they do keep going. And one of the things that they do is take advantage of the fact that the Egyptians have withdrawn from this region, but so have the Hittites. The Hittites are up north in what is today Turkey, ancient Anatolia, and their empire had come so far south that they were butting up against the Egyptians and their control of the region, such that there's a major battle fought at a place called Kadesh. There's a major battle fought at Kadesh in about 1274 BC, give or take, which is today in modern Syria, but that's where the Egyptians and Hittites fought over control. And it wound up being a draw, but both sides claimed victory. But so at the end of the late Bronze Age, not only do we see the Egyptians withdraw from the region, but so do the Hittites, because the Hittites, they collapse. So suddenly the Phoenicians are freed of anybody sitting on top of them. And they're also able to take advantage of the fact that there is chaos. And for example, that the site of Ugarit on the coast of North Syria is one of the areas that collapses. Right? I mentioned that there are tablets that have been newly translated, first into French, then into English, where they mention not only famine in Ugarit, but invaders. And indeed, the French excavators of Ugarit have shown that Ugarit was destroyed by humans. There's a meter of deposit of destruction. There are arrowheads in the walls, and there are hoards buried under the floors, but the people never came back for them. And in fact, Ugarit was abandoned for the next 400, 500, 600 years. Now, Ugarit had been a major player on the seas, sending out ships to Crete, for example, to the Aegean. And when Ugarit goes down and is destroyed, the Phoenicians see an opportunity and they take over. And as one of my colleagues has called it, the Mediterranean became a Phoenician lake, which is in fact the title of this third chapter. And the Phoenicians start sailing the wine dark sea and taking with them items like purple dye, which becomes extremely well known and desired, but also they standardized the alphabet. And this standardized alphabet is then spread. They take it to Greece, where it becomes the Greek alphabet. They take it to Italy and the Western Mediterranean, where it becomes the Latin alphabet, which, of course, we're still using today. Right? We use the Latin alphabet to write English, Spanish, French, German, Italian, right? All the Romance languages. But it's also linked to other writing systems as well. So the Phoenicians are not just resilient, they are what I would call anti-fragile. And I've borrowed that term from Nassim Nicholas Taleb, who's got a book with that name. And the definition of anti-fragile essentially is flourishing in an age of chaos, that you're taking advantage of it. And that's exactly what the Phoenicians do. And so they flourish where everyone else is going down. So in my table where I rank everybody, Phoenicians are in the top category. They are more than simply resilient. They are the new face of this new age. But they're not alone because they have a companion in that top category. And that companion are the Cypriots from Cyprus, because they have also pivoted. They have also transformed. They are also anti-fragile. And in fact, when we see the trade routes from the Eastern Mediterranean to the Aegean and on to the Western Mediterranean, in fact, as far as Spain, we have Phoenician visitations and then settlements in Spain by the 9th century BC. And they may have been there as early as the 11th century. Virtually everywhere that the Phoenicians are, also are the Cypriots. They also are sailing the wine dark sea. But what they are bringing, not purple dye and not the alphabet, they are bringing iron. They're bringing iron weapons, iron tools, and the technology, the techniques. They are spreading the knowledge of how to work iron. Now, in the Bronze Age, the Cypriots were known for their copper. That's where everybody got their copper. And to make bronze, of course, you need 90% copper and 10% tin. So the tin's coming mostly from Afghanistan, some from Turkey, some from Cornwall, but mostly Afghanistan in modern terms. That's where the tin's coming from. The copper is coming from Cyprus. Now, working copper and making bronze is very different from making iron. And yet, some of the leading archaeometallurgists, the archaeologists who study ancient metallurgy, they have said that the Cypriot metalsmiths making the bronze out of the copper would already have run across iron accidentally, basically. And that at the end of the late Bronze Age, when perhaps tin was becoming scarce, there's a big argument about whether it was or not, but regardless, that it would have been the Cypriot metalsmiths that are the first to start working in iron. And indeed, the earliest weapons and tools we see are bimetallic. They're made out of two metals. For instance, there are a bunch of knives and daggers where the blade is made of iron and the hilt, which would have been inlaid with bone or wood or ivory, that hilt is held on with rivets, and the rivets are made of bronze. So you've got both bronze and iron. So kind of a transition. And we find these bimetallic knives and daggers everywhere in Greece, in the southern Levant, and it's quite clear that the Cypriots are bringing them. And with the objects, they're bringing the techniques. And of course, every country in that region's got iron ore, right? It just is everywhere. And so once they were able to figure out how to work it, then the technology just spread like wildfire. And one of the things I do in the book is try to tamp down on a couple of myths that are prevalent on the internet, especially. One you will see is that, oh, the Hittites invented iron. No, they did not. That was a mistranslation of a text very long ago, which has never gone away. Another one you'll see is that the Sea Peoples, that's how they were able to defeat everybody, as they came roaring in with iron weapons. No, the Sea Peoples had bronze weapons, just like everyone else. And the other thing you will see, and that I dismiss right at the beginning of the book, is that the Dorians invade. The Dorian invasion of Greece, and they come in with iron weapons, and that's how they're able to take over Greece. Well, there is no such thing. The Dorian invasion is a myth. It did not happen. There's no archaeological evidence. It's a mirage. The later Greeks, Herodotus and Thucydides, mentioned it in part to try and explain how you get different dialects of Greek later, the Ionic dialect, the Doric dialect, and so on. But there's no Dorians waving iron weapons coming in at 1200 BC, even though you will still see it in like online encyclopedias. It still talks. So I begin the book by dismissing that. So just as the Phoenicians do the alphabet and purple dye, so too do the Cypriots do iron. And that's why both of them get up in the top category in terms of resilience and survivability and adaptability.
Now that you were talking about the Dorians, let's use that to talk about what was happening in the Aegean. And one of the things that you tried to do eventually, although it's beyond just the Aegean, is to a bit argue against the label of a dark age, right? That it's usually used to talk about exactly what was happening in Greece after the collapse. What was happening in the Aegean? Why do you think that a dark age is probably not the best way of framing that?
Good questions. Okay, so one of the chapters I talk about the Aegean, I talk about the Mycenaeans and Minoans and what happened to them and what happens in the Iron Age in Greece, so mainly Greece and Crete. And I'm afraid, and I was personally saddened by this because I love the Mycenaeans and Minoans, but they didn't do so well. They are in category 4 out of 5 on my rankings. They're not resilient as a society, but there is some continuity to their successors who did eventually rebound. So, for instance, there is nobody that really calls themselves a Mycenaean or a Minoan after the collapse of the late Bronze Age. All right, we do still refer to them as Greeks or as Cretans or something like that, but what we would identify as Mycenaean society or Minoan society essentially goes away, right? So we know that the central administration of the Mycenaeans collapses. We know that writing disappears, right? Linear B, the accounting system for the palaces, nobody is using that after 1100 BC or so. And even the Mycenaean pottery is gone by about 1050 BC at the latest. So they do hang around for a bit, and there's a cultural continuity, that's for sure. For instance, the names of the gods and goddesses, which we already know back in the Bronze Age, that they were mentioning Zeus and Hera and Poseidon in the Linear B tablets. Those obviously continue in the Iron Age in Greece. Other terms, though, like administrative terms, back in the Bronze Age, we had the Wanaks as the great king, and Basileus as a kind of a lesser administrative official. In the Iron Age, Wanaks goes away. There is no more Wanaks, no more great king. And instead, Basileus takes over. So in the Iron Age, Basileus is the king. So we see some continuity, but changes. And what they essentially have to do is rebuild from the ground up, right? The society is gone, the economy is gone. This is all part of a systems collapse. Writing is gone. They lose the knowledge of putting up, constructing huge buildings. So they have to, again, start from the ground up. And indeed, a lot of people died and a lot of people migrated. At one point, the scholars studying Iron Age Greece, who called it Dark Age Greece, by the way, and we'll get back to that, they had estimated that anywhere between 70 and 90% of the population had died in during the collapse and in the immediate aftermath. Now we think that's a bit exaggerated, and only 40 to 60 people died or migrated. I mean, that's still a huge amount. And people like Ian Morris, who have studied this at Stanford, and Sarah Murray, who did her dissertation at Stanford and is now teaching at the University of Toronto. They now give population figures such that, say, the population of mainland Greece had been at about 600,000 people before the collapse, and then it comes down to about 330,000 people in the century or so after the collapse. So, 40 to 50 to 60%. That's still pretty major, right? That's, one in every two is dying or migrating. So it used to be that the previous scholars, as I just mentioned, called it a dark age. Now, the thing to remember is that when scholars call a place a dark age, they're usually just meaning that there's a lack of written records and it's dark for us. We don't really know what went on. We don't have enough archaeology that tells us about it. But it also says that there's frequently a simplification of society, that everything goes down to a lower socio-political economic level, right, in the aftermath, which does look like it's the case for Iron Age Greece. They do retreat. It is lower social, it is lower political, it is lower economic. But the general public, when you talk about a dark age, they think it's total collapse, total degeneration, that you've got, wild dogs howling and barbarians prowling, and you've got the frightened survivors that are just squatting in the ruins. And it's not quite like that. And in fact, even though this Iron Age does meet the criteria that one could lay out for a dark age, like losing writing and losing your centralized economy, all the part of a systems collapse. We don't see that everywhere, and we don't see it to the same extent everywhere. And so most scholars, including all my colleagues at Stanford and elsewhere, are trying to get rid of the term dark age. For one thing, we know a lot more about it than we used to. And for another, it looks like this is a period that is as much about invention and innovation as it is about just mere survival. I mean, we just talked about the Phoenicians with purple dye and standardized alphabet. We just talked about Cypriots with iron. Those are all evidence of invention and innovations. And so there are a number of people that think that we may be seeing kind of measured change here, that we have to talk about both collapse and transformation, which I would agree with. But the general public doesn't know yet that the scholars have been dismissing the term dark age, right? Just like the people that do the Middle Ages don't want their period called dark ages anymore, right? Same with us. We want to get rid of the dark age because it's not so much. And indeed, uh, the Greeks themselves, as John Papadopoulos down at UCLA said, he said, the Greeks themselves knew of no dark age. Why not trust their better judgments? And so that's how I end the book, with saying, indeed, why not trust their better judgment? Let's not call it the Dark Age anymore. Let's just call it the Iron Age, because that doesn't have any sociopolitical associations, economic associations. It's a label that doesn't cast any aspersions. It's simply a statement that many of the tools and weapons now were made out of iron. And in fact, Hesiod calls it the Iron Age, right? I wish I weren't living in this age of iron. So I use the Aegean, the transition from Mycenaeans and Minoans into the period of the Iron Age Greeks as kind of fodder for this. And let's call it the Iron Age, and realize that when the Greeks on both Crete and the mainland do get their act back together, well, they're off and running, aren't they? Right? Hesiod, Homer, Sappho, the Greek poets, little thing called Athenian democracy, small buildings like the Parthenon. You know, the Greeks do pretty well once they bounce back. But they're among the slowest of the eight societies to bounce back. It's only really when they get their act together by the early 8th century, by 776 BC, if you will, the first Olympics, that we can talk about the globalized network having been reestablished across the Mediterranean. You know, it never went completely away, but it did collapse such that Mycenaeans and Assyrians and Hittites and all of them, you know, they're not interacting anymore. But by the beginning of the 8th century, we are once again in contact between Egypt and the Levant and Greece and all that. The names have changed, right? Now we've got Phoenicians and Neo-Hittites and later Greeks and all of that. But we do get the reestablishment of what I would call the globalized Mediterranean, to follow Sucheret and others. We get that back by the beginning of the 8th century. So for me, the Mycenaeans, the Greeks on the mainland and on Crete, are an epitome of what it takes to pull yourself back up.
That's fantastic, and I would love to ask you many, many more questions. What we should definitely do is have you here and give you a few hours to talk about this. But let me ask you one final question, I guess, to wrap up our conversation about the big picture reflection on collapse and recovery, right? And in the last chapter, you try to approach this issue with these different tools from different disciplines that you already mentioned. But what do you think then that are those features that explain the diversity of the rebound paths, right? Why do some of these societies recover more slowly? Some others never fully recover, as the Hittites, although the story there was so interesting that I would have loved to talk more about that. But how do you explain that diversity, and what are the big takeaways for today, right? If we then need to learn something about this, about how to recover from a crisis, what should we be paying attention to?
Yeah. Again, just small questions there, small questions, yes. Well, I did take a stab at it at the end of the book. The problem is we've got eight societies and we have eight different reactions and ways to claw their way back or not, as the case may be. So it's very hard to come down with any general overview, blanket statements. This is what you should do, because frankly, every case is different. And we shouldn't be surprised at that. But I did try to come up with some things, most of which I would say are common sense, and that you'd probably come up with anyway without having read the book. If I said, you know, here's a pen and paper, here's a laptop, write down what you think we would need to do to survive. right? If our society collapses, what do we need to do? So, in looking especially at societies like the Assyrians, who did extremely well. They kept their king, they kept the administration, they kept their economy, they kept their writing, they kept on building large constructions. Um, that's not to say they're not affected. They get hit by famine and drought too, a little bit later than everybody. And in fact, they practiced cannibalism at one point, we know from their records. But the Assyrians eventually bounced back, and by the 9th century BC, they're conquering most of the ancient Near East. They are the next big new empire. So I was looking at them in particular, what did it take? But then pulling in the others. And one thing, again, this is all just common sense. Um, you need multiple contingency plans in place and redundant systems. So if your primary ones fail, you've got, plan A, plan B, plan C. But again, that's nothing that nobody hasn't been saying for decades now, right? You always need contingency plans and redundant backup systems. You also need to be resilient enough to withstand whatever comes, whether it's enemy invasions or attacks or whatever. But you also need to be inventive and innovative. You need to be nimble. You need to transform. You need to adapt rather than just cope. If you just cope, you're going to muddle along. But if you can adapt or transform, like iron, something like that, then you're going to be in good stead. And I would say right there that in the original book, I was quoting my friend and colleague Carol Bell, who had compared tin in the ancient world to oil today. I would now change that a bit, and I would compare the tin back then and the need for it to rare earths today, and the need for things like lithium and the stuff that goes into microchips, for example, right? That's pretty much the comparison today. And so if your supply chain gets cut off, you need to suddenly invent new stuff, right? So just like the Cypriots went from copper and bronze to iron, same thing. Um, the other thing, though, that I noticed, the ones that were the most successful back then are the ones that were more self-sufficient than the others. I don't mean going totally isolationist. You still need your friends for assistance and raw material and all that. But the more self-sufficient you are, the more likely you're going to be able to weather any kind of collapse. And speaking of weather, but spelled a different way, kind of, sort of. Whether you are able to survive the weather is something that we are concerned with today. They definitely had drought back then. They definitely had climate change. And we've got that today. I mean, just look at what's happening in California, right? With the mega drought that's been around for at least 10 years. So one of the things that I suggested is that, you should prepare for extreme weather conditions, because then if they do come, if they do happen, you're ready. And if they don't happen, yeah, it doesn't matter, right? You prepared. Okay, it didn't work. Yeah, I mean, it didn't happen. No problem. But be prepared. And above all, and again, California comes into this, you need dependable water resources. That's in part why the Assyrians and Babylonians survived, is because they're on the Tigris and Euphrates. And even Egypt was on the Nile. Of the big four, Assyrians, Babylonians, Hittites, and Egyptians, only the Hittites really go down. They didn't have a big water source. That Halys River's there, but that's not big. And so you need dependable water resources. And I know that people today that are the futurists that are looking ahead are saying that water resources are going to become more and more important, and that future wars will probably be fought over water resources. So I would say make sure you have dependable water. And then the last thing that I suggested, which is the age-old thing, keep your working class happy. Keep the 99% happy, or you're going to have trouble if you're the 1%. So that was what I came up with at the end. And again, as I say, they're all common sense. They're all things that everyone has suggested already, from economists to social scientists to whatever. But in looking back at the collapse and then the Iron Age, It really is true. That is really what happened back then. And so I do think that there are lessons for us today. But I end the book asking kind of rhetorically, so what are we today? Are we going to be Phoenicians and be anti-fragile? Or are we going to be Mycenaeans and are we going to, go back to ground zero and have to build up again? What are we? And I end the book just saying, future generations are going to have to tell us when future archaeologists come back and excavate our civilization. They will tell us if we transformed, or if we adapted, or if we just coped, or if we disappeared. We'll have to leave it to our future generations and future archaeologists.
That's beautiful. That's a great way of finishing this conversation. And it's very hopeful also in the sense that that probably means that we have the capacity to shape that future. So I'm very glad that we have the chance to talk about the book. The book is it's coming out pretty soon, right? I don't know if it's
It's
already on bookstores or you, but
mid-April. Come out mid-April.
probably you can pre-order it already. I'm going to
Yes.
put links for this so people can find it easily. But I'm super excited. I don't know if it's gonna be as popular as the prequel, but it's a fantastic book, and anyone who has read the first one is probably gonna be eager to see what happened afterwards. So thanks a lot, Eric. This was a great conversation.
Thank you. And my pleasure. Always happy to talk about this. Lots of fun. And yeah, you can get the book at your local bookstore, Amazon, Princeton University Press, but we'll see. And hopefully people are as interested in resilience and what happens after collapse as they are in collapse itself. But we shall see. At any event, it's been a pleasure to talk with you about it. So thank you for having me on.
Thank you. Thank you for tuning in today to the Economic and Political History Podcast. Don't forget to stay connected with us on YouTube and Spotify. I'm your host, Javier Mejia from Stanford University. Feel free to follow me on Twitter at Javier Mejia C and connect with me on LinkedIn. You can find me as Javier Mejia Cubillos. Until next time, stay engaged, thank you, and take care.